Most situations in life begin with a love story. At 15, I fell in love with hairstyling. At 20, America. At 21, on my very first trip there, Las Vegas. At 23, men's hairstyling when it was a new industry. At 28, speaking. At 32, the National Speakers Association. And let's fast forward to when I was 60 and I bought a home in Las Vegas. I live in San Francisco still. This is my second home, and I am a great consumer of entertainment. And when I was first there, within a few months, I saw Elton John perform, Cher, and Tom Jones. And they were all absolutely magnificent. And then on reflection, I realized I am watching them in my 60s. I had seen them all in my 20s. And as a speaker, I couldn't help but reflect. One, what did these stars do to maintain a fan base for 40 years? Then, to attract new fans who weren't even born when they were in their heyday. And what did they do to stay excited about the very competitive world of show business? And then the speaker in me thought, how does that relate to speakers? In fact, Brad, can you bring up the poll of, do people consider themselves a beginner, intermediate, or advanced speaker?
Absolutely.
Because as a 43-year member of the National Speakers Association, and I asked this poll because last night when we asked it, I was surprised that 10% were getting paid to speak and 63% of our audience last night wanted to get paid. So as a 43-year member of the National Speakers Association, someone who was interested in speaking even before that, I look at, one, how do speakers and those who make a living stay excited? I know even speakers in Toastmasters who have no interest in being professional speakers or getting paid stay vital by helping others. There's a certain exhilaration from helping other people what you know. So let's see right now. We'll keep it up for a little bit longer. So what we will be going over in this session is, one, how do you connect to your audience? Then, all right, your polls there. How do you open your presentation with impact? The first 30 seconds, the last 30 seconds are the most important. So we'll be looking at how do you open, ways that you can tell your stories even better than you do now, and how to be more specific. So let's see, Brad, at this point, we have 21% beginners, let's see, 58% intermediate, and then we have 20% who are thinking, I am so damn good, Miss Fripp, I should be giving this presentation rather than you. These principles that we will be looking at are exactly the same whether you're speaking to 1, 5, 50, or 500. Now, I don't know about you, but I am a short-term project person. And I was creating my online learning system, Fripp VT, which was a long-term, very detailed project, not part of my real personality. And I received an email Dear Patricia, I'm a big fan of yours. May I interview you for my blog? And I thought, well, I really don't want to be distracted. So I wrote an email and said, I am honored. I am flattered. I would love to be interviewed. Can you contact me in 3 months? And I thought, well, before I hit send, let me check his website. So naturally, I picked up the phone. Now that you know how dreadfully shallow I am, and said, what is an award-winning TV interviewer and game show host doing being my friend? And being my fan. And after 30 minutes, we were friends. And he said, Patricia, this is really fabulous information. I've got enough for at least 6 blog posts. But come on, tell me, what is the #1 secret of being a powerful, persuasive presenter? And I said, oh, there's no one secret. And then it hit me. And I said, although there may not be one secret, if there were, it would be that your subject is of interest to your audience. So for the women amongst us, I thought I would show you Todd Newton one more time. So the secret is that your subject is of interest to your audience. And you're probably wondering, well, as some people have said to me, Patricia, I speak on dull subjects. Or one gentleman in one of my classes said, I speak on OSHA rules and regulations for 8 hours. And here's the secret. There is no boring subject. There are only boring speakers. And how you make your subject of interest to your audience is, I don't know what it is about Todd Newton, I want to keep going back, is you have to think as you put together your presentation, think like an audience advocate. You have to make sure that your subject looks at it from their point of view. And one way that you can show you are focused on giving value to your audience is to watch your I versus you ratio. For example, I would never recommend you say, I am going to talk about. It would be, this is what you will learn. This is what we can look forward to. Make it more inclusive. Then, and you might have heard this principle before, we want our audience to think we are talking to them. Now, at this moment, I am speaking to you probably alone. However, if there were 500 of you sitting in a room, the secret is you still talk to one person. Because if I said, how often have you had this experience? You see, I'm talking to one person, not how often has everyone in this room had this experience? Now watch your language, you focused, talking to one person, and everyone will hear the speaker is talking to them. Now, at this point, Brad, I don't know that we would have any questions or comments that I need to be aware of.
Well, look, Jessica is all over that in the chat. Do we have anything there? I haven't seen anything, Jessica.
No, we don't have any questions.
All right.
Okay, but feel free. Last night we had so many questions we couldn't get to them. However,
Right,
Brad
right
will
out.
select at appropriate times when you see these question marks some of the best pithy, short, specific questions. What you might also want to do, Brad, is just as a matter of interest, bring up a poll. Are people getting paid, want to get paid, or no interest in getting paid? They're in Toastmasters just for the development to help them with their lives and careers.
All right, I'll launch that poll now.
Okay, good. So let's move to our second point, which is come out punching. The purpose of your opening is to arouse interest in their subject, because most professionals, and I work a lot with engineers in the corporate world, most people are fine if they know what they're talking about once they get started. Very few know how to open and conclude. So we are going to look at several ways. Just hold on.
Welcome to You Have Choices, Options of Openings, the Techniques. As you soon will come to discover, our subtitle is How to Open Your Presentation with Impact. At the beginning of a speech, presentation, seminar, client meeting, report to senior management, sales presentation, or any manner of presentation you deliver, you need to arouse interest in the subject. After all, we stand in the rain to see a movie. Would you stand in the rain to listen to your presentation?
And that, of course, is the virtual Fripp from Fripp VT. But this is the point. Would you stand in the rain to hear your presentation? I don't know, but let's look at a few techniques that might increase the likelihood that your audience would. And at this point, Brad, I see we are up at 66% would like to get paid. All right, good. All right, if we can close that. There we are. All right, so opening technique 1, a question. Interesting statistic or little known fact. Simplify your role or tell a story. These are 4 areas that we will look in. So the question, and in the chat, you can put yes, 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 or no. Do you ever begin your presentation with, have you ever? Have you ever walked into a room to network and you were terrified to start a conversation? Have you ever stood up to speak and forgotten what you were going to say? All right, Brad, do we have some people saying yes or no?
We do. I see a lot, Jessica. Do you? Look at all those yeses.
All right. Then for those who are saying yes, here is a magic word for you.
Absolutely, Stephen.
OFTEN. This is the difference. How often have you walked in a room of strangers that you genuinely want to meet and were too nervous to start a conversation? How often have you stood up to speak and forgotten what you were going to say? This is the subtle difference. You see, if I said, have you ever stood up to speak and forgotten what to say? Yes, and I lived through it. If we say, how often have you? You really need my advice because it happens more than once. So this is how I suggest, how often have you? That one difference will grab the audience, because when it comes to go from good to great, especially for those of you who are advanced, it's the subtlety. I know as a speech coach for executives and engineers and sales teams, I have really done my job when my clients are analyzing the use of one word. There's another technique with a question that I like to use, and this is a rhetorical question. If I were to ask you, is 2020 the year that you doubled the quality of your presentation skills? Perhaps you'd say yes. Perhaps you'd say no. Most likely you would say, Patricia, I would love it to be. Can you tell me how? Well, good news. You're at the right place at the right time. In the next 53 minutes, you will learn 4 specific ways that you can do that. So you see, it's if I were to ask you, it's yes, no, and I would like it to be. And the point here is, I know as a professional speaker for decades, the biggest challenge, even if an audience loves you, they can't remember your name. I find ways as often as possible, Brad, to put my name in. Patricia, I would love it to be. Can you tell me how? Right. So that's the first. So we've got a question. Let's look at an interesting statistic. One of my all-time favorites, and you notice from these openings you go into the premise. And one of my favorite interesting statistics or little known facts, I was booked to speak to 350 Seventh-day Adventist pastors. The subject was how to design and deliver a charismatic sermon. I was the 4th day of a conference in Los Angeles. And you know, Brad, in Los Angeles, if you're not good, they're getting out of there to beat the traffic. And I would expect people to look at the program. And if we're on a program, we got to consider this. When they look at your write-up and your bio, how excited are they? So I would expect people to look and say, she's the only person on the program who isn't a minister. How can anyone who isn't a minister tell me how to write a new sermon and a better sermon because I do it every week? I bet she isn't even a Seventh-day Adventist, which I'm not. They probably, being a kind and generous audience, as you, who might have no idea who I am, to think, well, the people organizing the program probably know something that she has done is worth putting her on the program. And this is the importance of the opening. Because everyone is going to think, never heard of her, never heard of him, I don't know if I'm interested in this subject. This is why the purpose of the opening is to arouse interest in your subject. And I walked on stage and said, 465 times in the Bible, it said it came to pass. It did not say it came to stay. And unless your sermon is well crafted and scripted and dynamically delivered, it will not come to stay in the hearts, minds, and lives of your congregation. And if you have never heard 350 Seventh-day Adventist pastors or 350 of any audience say, Amen, Hallelujah, after your opening line, you have not lived. Many of my engineers, and I guarantee if you look at some of your presentations, somewhere inside there, if it's more than a few minutes, there is probably an interesting statistic or little known fact. And if you do that, bring it up to the beginning and add an emotion. Would it interest you to know? Would it surprise you to know? Would it shock you to know? Would it amaze you to know? Pause and then give the statistic. Because talking about bringing your audience in, anytime they hear, would it interest you to know? Would it surprise you to know? They're going to think, oh, what? And that's why you deliver the line and you pause. Now, the next technique, and do we have any questions or comments at this point, Bran, before I go to the next technique?
Oh, we have quite a few. By the way, on your yes/no question earlier, we got 29 yeses, 6 nos. That's 83%. We even got an amen, hallelujah.
Yay!
How about that?
Yeah.
Here's one for you. How does one go from speaking for free to getting paid? It's just 101 question, huh?
All right. Well, you create a speech that is so good that people would pay for it. And we discussed this yesterday. So first of all, you have to make money, you have to be a great speaker and a good marketer. And you have to understand the industry, which is why I recommended, if you stay in Toastmasters practice, you also need to check out the National Speakers Association, which is an association for people who get paid or really want to. And then you tell everybody you know, I have a speech on, please invite me to your group. And even when you're speaking for free, when people come up and say, as they did to me, what would you charge to say that to my audience? So with this, we'll keep going. And if you have any questions about opening lines, because I know when we have a large audience, to keep on track, to keep your schedule, I need to deliver what I promised. But are there any questions about openings before I go to simplifying your role?
No, I don't see opening questions.
Okay, all right, good.
Opening lines. All
right. Simplify your role. I invited my next door neighbor, Mike Powell, to speak to a group of professional women that I was part of, the Continental Breakfast Club. And he is a senior scientist, or he was at the time a senior scientist at Genentech. And I said, Mike, I want you to come talk to my audience. And you got to realize we don't spend time with scientists. And even if we did, we probably wouldn't know what they were talking about. So in the opening of your presentation, I want you to tell us, what is it like being a scientist? So he opened his presentation this way. Being a scientist is like doing a jigsaw puzzle in a snowstorm at night, when you don't have all the pieces and you don't have the picture you're trying to create. I defy you to come up with an explanation of what you do that is as visual, because it's, look at the words, they are visual. Being a scientist is like, that's your opening line. Being a speech coach is like, being a DTM is like, being a district governor is like, being an engineer is like, whatever your role, because there's the professional role, there's your volunteer role, there might even be being the mother of 8 children is like. This would be an interesting creative exercise for you. It would also be a great way that you can begin a presentation. Then let's look at the next technique. So a review, question and rhetorical question. And if it's a question, have you ever, it's how often. An interesting statistic, and with interesting statistics, add the emotion. Simplify your role colorfully, because Mike's, the words were picture words. In fact, Eugene Schwartz wrote a book that is long out of print about the best way to speak and write to engage an audience. It's called The Brilliance Breakthrough. It's out of print. Last time I saw it was $936 secondhand. But this is the premise. He said, forget nouns, adjectives, pronouns, adverbs. Think of verbs, think of words as picture words and connecting words. Because some words give you more information than the time it takes to deliver them. For example, our company delivers service like the Ritz-Carlton, and we deliver it at speed of FedEx. See, there's a lot of information. In the context of one of my other presentations I was coaching, The woman who was a lawyer said, "He promised her many things." I said, "No, he didn't. He promised her a life of romance and adventure." And in the context of that speech, you could understand why the young woman she was talking about, would leave the safety of her home and go off with this man. This is the power of words, picture words. And if you can use them to engage an audience, especially at the beginning, all the way through, but this is the important. In a snowstorm, at night, your picture just changed. So think of that. And then a story. One of the principles about stories I learned from my friend Michael Haig. He is a screenwriting and story consultant in Los Angeles. And his technique is get into the scene late. We have a slide which we will show you, but it's get into the scene late. So for example, although stories are powerful all the way through your presentation, it's a good technique to open if you choose to. Think of this. If my opening was, Mary had a problem. Oh, okay. So you've introduced a character. What are you thinking? Mary had a problem. Who's Mary? What's her problem? Then you need to give Mary a backstory. Mary was a seasoned HR professional. For 20 years, she'd worked in Fortune 100 companies. Now you know Mary is seasoned. She's worked in very impressive companies. So what do you know about Mary? I would assume you would think Mary eats problems for lunch. With her background and seasoning, people come to Mary to solve their problems. So you know, if she has a problem, it's got to be big. Now we're only 2 short phrases into this story. Then bring the situation. Brad walked into her office and said, "Mary, we're about to be sued for $36 million and I think it was my fault." Wouldn't you want to see what happens next? So these are just 4 of the many ways, and on the handout page that we're going to show you later, with a handout for all my 3 sessions here, and a lot more, including a list of opening lines, 2 pages of opening lines, the words and the techniques are available for you. So let's go back to, let's see what we have. All right, so let's move on. All right, any questions that I need to take before I move on, Brad?
We have a question about openings.
Yes.
Once you've crafted your speech, and do you advise changing your opening depending on the audience or varying it at all?
Well, it depends what your opening is. And if you're going to deliver a 30-minute presentation or 20 minutes onwards, I mean, not a 5-minute story, it's all built around the premise. So very often you have your premise and then you structure it around, and then you might go back and see the opening and the close. Or you might have a handful of openings. Now, certainly you would change it. You might deliver your opening line or your opening story. Then you might say, as mostly seasoned Toastmasters, or as sophisticated engineers. So what would change is when you make the connection to the audience, to let them know, I understand who's in the audience. Good openings. Obviously, I often write an opening that ties into Seventh-day Adventist pastors, not an opening I would use any other place. You make the connection by acknowledging the audience. Earlier in my career, I I attended probably 12 different screenwriting classes as part of my personal discipline. I've always invested heavily in my own education from different points of view. And I promise you, I have no talent or patience or interest in being a screenwriter, but you got to admit, Hollywood knows how to tell a good story. And one of the more famous screenwriting teachers is Robert McKee. And he says stories are the creative conversion of life itself into a powerful, clearer, more meaningful experience. And what is good about stories, we use words to communicate. However, people see the stories. This is why words like Mike Powell, being a scientist is like doing a jigsaw puzzle in a snowstorm. So there are words that create pictures, and then there are stories that we see. Now, in my simple example of Mary had a problem, you'll probably see Mary different ways. If you're in corporate America and you've got an HR director who's very seasoned, you might have seen that person in the story. See, it really doesn't matter how our audience sees the story, and depending on how we set it up, they will see it different ways. So we use words to communicate. They will remember what they see. Stories are about people. We have to populate our stories with flesh and blood characters that the audience can relate to. So, for example, I know many of you are fans, and you can put in the chat box if you're a fan of Darren LaCroix, Ed Tate, Craig Valentine, Mark Brown. And just put yes, yes, yes if you're fans of my buddies. And for many years, we delivered a seminar together called Lady and the Champs. Of course, I was the lady, they're the champs. And as I always like to sass the champs, I taught you everything you know. I haven't taught you everything I know. And in one of the sessions that I was holding, I brought people up to the stage for mini coaching, which we're doing this afternoon with our mini coaching. And one gentleman, Steve, said, when I was a little boy growing up, I was deaf, and although the audience was sympathetic and had a certain empathy, I could tell they hadn't made a connection with him. And what I suggested was, tell your story from a different point of view. And this was my recommendation that he did next. Imagine how my parents felt as the doctor walked into the waiting room and said, I hate to tell you, your beautiful baby boy is deaf. There was a whole different feel in the room because nobody in my audience was deaf. A very high percentage had children. When you look at your stories, you can look at them from different points of view. So you need to populate your stories with flesh and blood characters that the audience can relate to. And there are different ways you can introduce your characters. I wish you could meet my friend Mike. Now, give Mike a backstory. And here's another principle. You don't report on the dialogue, you deliver the dialogue. So, for example, in my story with Mary, I did not say, Brad walked in and told her about a problem that the company had that he thought he had created. No, Mary, we're going to be sued for $36 million and I think it's my fault. Because when you deliver the dialogue, you can put the emotion in. It makes your characters come alive. So populate your stories with characters they can relate to, or find ways to make them relate to them. I bet you loved your mother. If you'd met mine, St. Edith of the Valleys, born in South Wales. All right, so you see, I'm bringing you into my story and you deliver the dialogue. The principle is your characters speak and we want to hear what they have to say. And here is an example of how dialogue drives this story forward. I was coaching an executive for a very important presentation to 1,500 salespeople. And he was talking about corporate citizenship. There'd been a tsunami and the salespeople had donated $360,000 that the company matched. And I was not about to tell a brilliant executive that I'd never met before that his speech at this point, which was an important point of the presentation, it was boring. I wasn't going to say that. So instead I asked him the question, how do you explain corporate citizenship to your children? He said, Patricia, it was the day after Christmas and I sat both my children down. And I told them, you are very lucky children. You have generous parents and even more generous grandparents. And perhaps you'd like to take one of your gift certificates or one of your presents, give them back. We will cash them in and give the money to children who no longer have homes. I was so proud of my 14-year-old son. He said, Papa, how much should I give? Because I could give you all of my savings and all of my pocket money and all of my Christmas presents, and it wouldn't be enough to make a difference. How much do I give? And Bernard said, I told him, oh, you never give it all. You just give enough that it hurts a little. Brad, if you transcribe that story, it takes less than 1 minute to tell, and you would see the quotation marks. It's nearly all dialogue. That's what we mean about your characters speak. And last night, if you were tuned in, I was talking about how it was such a great education for me as a young woman asking questions. And it really positioned me to be a speech coach, because I ask questions, pull my clients' words out of their mouths, polish them up and pop them back in. That is a rather simplified version, but that's what I do. And Michael Haig, he is the Hollywood story consultant, who's my friend. He will be a great speaker at one of the other conferences. Brad, in person, or even if you're still virtual, which will stop at some point. He says, stories must be true, not 100% accurate. A good portion of my life is working with sales teams. And I tell them this and they laugh, and I say no, because what stories do is shrink time. Because if I help sales teams come up with a good, happy customer story that you can tell to prove that what you're selling works very well for people just like them. And the principle is, imagine you have a very happy customer, and in your story, they call you and say, help, and they could perfectly articulate this story. Or they could let's start again, rewind. Imagine your happy customer, when you first met them, they called and said, help, and could perfectly articulate their problem. Now, in real life, it might have taken 3 months till you get to that point. The sales process might have started with 3 other people. So it shrinks time, because you don't have months or hours to tell this story, every detail. You have 3 minutes. So that's it. A story has to be true, not accurate. And this is where you might change. The question is, do you change your opening depending on the audience? Well, when you transition into your premise, you certainly might. In a story, perhaps if you're talking to bankers, Mary would be a banker. If you're speaking for HR executives, she is an HR director. If you're talking to engineers. Mary might be an engineer. So the story is true. You're just changing the backstory slightly to match the audience. And again, get into the scene late, which is what we've already discussed. You don't have to say, well, Mary, every day she was, from a very young woman, she wanted to grow up and help people. And a counselor at high school tested her and said, Mary, you'd be great in HR. So she went to college and she got this degree, and then she worked her way up from an assistant. Who cares? Mary had a problem. 20 years experience. Fortune 100 companies. So you can see that's how stories shrink time, and you get into the scene late. All right. Are there any questions or comments, Brad, that I need to be aware of?
Just comments about the sticking, you talked about it a little bit, but sticking to personal stories or sharing stories that you've heard from other people, and when to use personal or other people's stories.
Well, this is the connect, and this is the advice. If you read a story in a book, you might say, I don't know if you've ever read this book. If you have, you are probably as fascinated as I was at the character in. Or, I wish you could have met my mother. So what is your connection? Because although I tell some personal stories as a speech coach, most of my presentations are a lot about my characters, my executives, my engineers that I help coaching. So I have a connection. It's an original me story. And last night we were talking about mining the treasure trove, which is your life. Believe me, you have more content. If you were going to write a speech, and I would challenge you, your next Toastmaster speech, write it about some situation that happened in the last month. It could even be yesterday. And the principle we were talking about yesterday, attribute meaning when there normally is none. Yesterday I woke up the same as every other day. I don't know about you. That's bringing you into my story. I think the only purpose to get out of bed in the morning is to make and drink my coffee. All right. So, any other, Brad? So,
question from Cynthia. How many times do you recommend rehearsing a story before adding it to your speech?
All right. Well, Cynthia, if it is a Toastmaster speech that it's your turn to deliver next week, perhaps 5, 6, 7, 8 times. I would, when you're driving to work, or personally, a lot of my rehearsal is on the treadmill, because when you're working, you're walking, you've got left brain and right brain triggering in, you can see structure and words come out. In fact, I've even written speeches on the treadmill, and I imagine and I talk out loud and then stop. I don't put my feet on the side while I take notes because of the process. If you're getting paid and you're going to deliver in your presentation, probably 40 times. Because the question professional speakers are asked more than any other are, how do you know a story is going to work the first time that you deliver it? Well, it's not the first time you told the story when it's in the speech. It's perfected as much as possible before it's in your speech. Good. Now, here's a principle that will also transform your stories. Now, you'll remember we talked about picture words, and we talked about people remember what they see based on the words. I was at a National Speakers Association chapter. Here's another technique. If you're on an online meeting, whether it's for work or you're delivering a presentation like this, you might need a drink. Use a straw. You might even want to select a straw that matches or highlights the color that you're wearing. I digress. I was at a National Speakers Association chapter, and I was bringing people up for mini coaching, as we do at 1:30 to 2:30 this afternoon. Not that I'm trying to build a big audience, however we are. Because you'll see in that session, it's seeing the principles we're introducing here from some of your Brad, I don't know how you selected the people who are going to be in the hot seat, but we're going to look at what their starting point is and any recommendations I might make. So this woman said, my dad walked into a diner, looked at the waitress and said, and thought, that's my wife, in 1946. And I said, I know this is a great story, but you have to put 1946 up front. Because if it begins in 1946, my dad walked into a diner, you do not have to have been born in 1946 to know this is the end of World War II. You have heard stories from your parents, your grandparents, you've seen movies to have a feel of what life was like right after World War II in America, in your town or your state. And also the picture of the diner changed. And you've been in theme restaurants and theme diners that are from another era. You know what I'm talking about. So in 1946, my dad walked into a diner. Now, I do not know about you, because remember, we all see pictures differently. And I want you to put in the chat box, yes, 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 or no, no, no. When I hear a line in 1946, my dad walked into a diner, I think he's a soldier. Put yes in the chat box, or no, if you, in your mind, in your story, with that set up, you'd think it was a soldier. And this is the secret, tying back to populating your story with flesh and blood characters. I attribute her dad to my Uncle Bill. Now, I grew up in England. My Uncle Bill wasn't a soldier, he was in the RAF. World War II for England began September the 3rd, 1939. My Uncle Bill got shot down on October the 16th. He spent the entire World War II in a prisoner of war camp. Now, I know from his stories, which he didn't tell anybody till 2001, I know he would never talk about what happened to his friends, family, his children even. So I know if her dad was a soldier, he had experiences he'll never tell his kids that he hasn't even had yet. So you see, I attribute the values and the feelings I have to my Uncle Bill to the character. And you remember, all she said is in 1946, my dad walked into a diner. Now, I don't know about you, but Brad, how many yeses do we have?
They flew by, Patricia.
Oh, good.
I saw some no's in there, but a lot of the yeses flew by. About 50%.
Good.
Of the people here said yes.
And you see, even if you're not into that story yet to know, you're only one line into a story. Now he walked into a diner. Now here's the next question. In my story, he walks up to the counter and sits down. Put a yes in the chat box if you, in your picture, would imagine he'd sit at the counter because he's alone. And I bet the waitress, now in my story, I'm not going to ask you for this one, but in my story, she's blonde. Maybe because I'm blonde. Now, I know with all these lights, my hair looks more silver, but it's really blonde. And I bet Brad, she said to him, would you like some coffee and pie, honey? And he thought, that's my wife. Now, what we did was we presented information in the way it's easier for people to remember. You deliver information for retention and impact. Where? So it starts when, where, who, what happened. And if you follow that format in your stories, they will have more impact. So for example, my dad traveled a lot when I was a little girl. No, when I was a little girl, my dad traveled a lot. All right, do we have any, what was the last question we asked? Do they think he sat at the counter?
There are people saying yes, about 90% yeses here, and there are people that were right on track with you on what you were about your story. So it was exciting to see it pop through in the chat.
Good. Now you understand, this is in 1946. My dad walked into a diner. He looked at the waitress and thought, that's my wife. It's only 4 short phrases. However, when you put it together in a simple, beautiful, elegant way, the audience sees more than it takes the time to say. And of course, this is just a setup to the presentation, which might be about her dad's life. It might be what she learned about romance from her parents. I don't know. In mini coaching, I only saw the opening. But you see, there are so many places you can go with that. You can then say, fast forward to 2003. I wish you could have been there when we celebrated my parents' 50th anniversary. So you see, it's just an opening scene. Alfred Hitchcock, the great movie director, said, a movie is like life with all the dull parts left out. So if you want your stories to be great, look at taking any words out that don't add to the drama, the flavor, the emotion. Jerry Seinfeld said, a good day's work is when I can edit an 8-word sentence into 5 words. In his case, he's funnier. In our case, our presentations are more memorable. Speak in shorter sentences and phrases. As you could see with the 1946, you do a build. At this point, Brad, I know we got to keep on time, so I will take one question if you've had a good one submitted.
There's a question, does there always need to be a moral, a takeaway, or a call to action to every single story?
No. It just is a flavor to set into where you're going. Not every story has to be life-changing. It's just a simple setup. 4 lines. All right, Brad, I can hear you typing.
Yeah, somebody there. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Oh, somebody is typing, yeah. So all learning needs repetition and reinforcement. And I hope one of the questions that you might have would be, oh, Patricia, this is good. How can I learn what it's taken you 43 years to learn? Well, first of all, any questions I do not answer, you can short, specific questions. You send me 3 paragraphs. I'm running a very busy little mini empire here. But any questions I do not answer, write to me at pfripp@fripp.com and put District 1 question in the headline. If you go to fripp.com/handouts, the handout of all 3 presentations put into one and a lot of other content that I will show you is available for you to download. If you would like, you can join my Facebook group on presentations. And if you would like to hear from me weekly, sign up for fripp.com/newsletter. And every Tuesday I send out a short, usually a video and a short article about presentations. My learning system, you saw a clip with the opening. Fripp Virtual Training is my interactive online learning, the best of what I've learned in 43 years in a very easy, convenient, fast and cost-effective way. And at fripp.com/blog, I have 1,000 blog posts around speaking and sales that you can take advantage of. So we have so much. We have over 500 videos on YouTube. So there's plenty of content you can take advantage of. When you go to the handout page, you see you have four clips that help you with your opening, your stories, and your speech structure. They are segments from my Fripp VT. You have my opening lines, the techniques and the words, my ebook on rockstar communications, my Fripp speech models, mistakes salespeople make, and pitfalls to avoid when you speak. All that content will help you with your development, and that's all given to you free. If you want to take all my presentation secrets that's taken me thousands and thousands of dollars to develop, go to Fripp VT and take a trial. You can take a trial, and you would use a discount if you were interested, Fripp, to save 20%. So go take a trial. If you want a demo, email me at pfripp@fripp.com. We'll hold your hand and show you around. Now, the last principle, Brad, and my coachees this afternoon, believe me, this is what I am looking for. Are you guilty of the unconscious goof that ruins your credibility? Avoid empty language. And talking about love stories from the beginning of our session, Brad, I think I fell in love with the power of words when my parents told me stories about Winston Churchill getting on the radio in the war and the power of his words. Specificity builds credibility. In your presentations and conversations, record yourself and your talks, because you will not improve what you're not aware of. If it's not fruit, it's not a bunch. I don't give you a bunch of ideas. I give you specific strategies. How many depends on your notes. And I hope you'll watch the replay and you'll get the handouts, and there's a lot more. If you can't weigh it, it's not tons. If it were not a thing, what would it be? And when you have people in your story, who are the people? For example, I coach engineers for a couple of major software companies. I mean, 100 at a time getting ready for conferences, all in Zoom. They're one at a time, but 100 a contract. And one of these brilliant engineers, and I'm sure we have brilliant engineers in our audience, and I promise you, Brad, these people are so smart, they have more brains in their little finger than I have in my body. I can just help them take their words and make them more powerful. And one of these brilliant engineers, and I'll just stop sharing for this, one of these brilliant engineers said, there are two things people love about. And I asked, if they weren't things, what would they be? He said, innovative upgrades. I said, there are billions of people in the world. What people love your innovative upgrades? He said, systems administrators. Can you see the difference in quality of there are two things people love about compared to two innovative upgrades that systems administrators love? That is the power of words. That is being specific. Especially if you want to get paid, as you perfect your presentations, you do need repetition and reinforcement. My brother Robert Fripp, many of you last night were King Crimson fans, and my next call, Brad, in 30 minutes is to my brother for his birthday. And in fact, we can put in the chat box if you are a Robert Fripp or King Crimson fan. Just yes, 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 if you are. And I called him one day, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm practicing my guitar while I'm watching a Steven Seagal movie." And he said, I said to him, "Well, you can't be focusing on both." And he said, "What I'm doing, sister, is building a muscle memory into my hands." Because if you've seen him play, his hands move really fast, but he sits there very calm and quietly. He focuses attention. You asked the question, Brad, from Cynthia, how often do you rehearse a story before you deliver it? And I said, if you want to get paid, at least 40 times, because you are building the muscle memory of remembering the words. Michael Caine, the Oscar winner, said, with acting, which is true with speaking, rehearsal is the work, performance is the relaxation. Do not think you can create your speech and then deliver it and have it a masterpiece. So Brad, I know we are absolutely on time. I think 3 minutes late. So are there any questions you must pose? I'm very aware I don't want to get you off track.
There are a lot of King Crimson fans there, so, and even your brother Robert, John White says hi. Big fan there. Our own John. Lots of love there.
Good. Well, I hope we will see everyone at 1:30 this afternoon to 2:30. Let me conclude with, I hope you will always remember Fripp. More importantly, remember what Fripp stands for when it comes to opening your presentation with impact, making a connection to your audience, improving your stories, and adding specificity to all your language, your conversations and presentations. Remember what Fripp stands for. Frequently reinforce ideas that are productive and profitable. Thank you.
Bravo, bravo.
All right.